I never thought I'd find myself here, standing in a wood-paneled courtroom in Nashville, watching my stepmother's face drain of color as I approached the witness stand. For 15 years, Diane had manipulated my father and systematically pushed me out of his life. When Dad died suddenly last spring, I was devastated but not surprised to learn I'd been completely cut out of his will. The signature looked right, but something felt wrong. I stayed silent through the funeral, through the reading of the will, through Diane's condescending, "I'm sure your father had his reasons," comments, while she moved his prized possessions into storage. But today, as the judge invites victims to make their statements in her forgery and fraud case, I finally have the floor. The thick manila folder in my hands contains everything: the original will my father made years ago, the evidence of her forgery, and 15 years of documented manipulation. As I unfold my statement, Diane's eyes meet mine across the courtroom. She thinks she knows what's coming. She has no idea. Dad and I were inseparable after Mom died when I was 8. For nearly a decade, it was just the two of us in our modest Knoxville home. He was a civil engineer who taught me to fish on the Tennessee River, helped with science fair projects, and never missed a soccer game. We had Friday movie nights with homemade pizza and root beer floats. He kept every award I ever won in a special drawer in his desk. "You're just like your mother," he'd say, brilliant and stubborn as hell. Everything changed when I was 17 and he met Diane at a community fundraiser. She worked in real estate, all designer clothes and perfect hair. Initially, I was happy for him. He deserved companionship after being alone for so long. But there were warning signs I was too young to recognize. The first Thanksgiving after they started dating, Dad invited Diane to our traditional meal. I'd made Mom's sweet potato casserole, the way we did every year. Diane took one bite, grimaced, and said, "Oh, honey, this is far too sweet. Let me show you how to make it properly next time." Dad laughed awkwardly while I fought back tears. Later that night, I overheard her telling Dad that teenagers need structure and that I seemed undisciplined. By the time they married 6 months later, Diane had already begun reshaping our lives. She convinced Dad to sell our home, too many memories holding you both back, and move to her McMansion in a gated community across town. My childhood bedroom furniture was deemed childish and replaced. Mom's recipe box mysteriously disappeared during the move. For my high school graduation, Dad had promised to give me Mom's sapphire ring. The night before the ceremony, I overheard them arguing. "That ring is worth thousands, Richard. You can't just give it to a teenager who'll probably lose it at some college party. Besides, I thought we agreed it would look perfect with my anniversary necklace." The next day, Dad handed me a department store jewelry box containing a small silver necklace instead. When I asked about Mom's ring, his eyes darted to Diane before he muttered something about keeping it safe for when you're older. When I left for college at Vanderbilt, Diane's transformation of Dad accelerated. He'd always been proud of his Southern roots, but suddenly he was accompanying Diane to country club events, wearing clothes he would have mocked years earlier. My calls home became increasingly awkward, with Diane often answering and telling me Dad was too busy to talk. Dad had always promised to help with my college expenses. He'd started a fund when I was born. But in my sophomore year, when tuition increased, Dad seemed uncomfortable when I called about it. "Things are a bit tight right now," he said vaguely. Later, I learned Diane had convinced him to invest in several of her can't-miss real estate ventures instead. I took out additional student loans rather than fight about it. The real turning point came at my college graduation. Dad had promised to be there, but 2 days before, Diane called to tell me they couldn't make it. She'd surprised him with a cruise for his birthday. His birthday was 3 months away. When I finally reached Dad on his cell phone, he sounded confused, then defensive. "Diane put a lot of effort into planning this surprise. You're an adult now. You understand." I accepted my diploma with no family in the audience. What I didn't know then was that Dad had created a will when Mom died, leaving everything to me, with specific items cataloged. He'd updated it after marrying Diane, but still left his personal possessions, family heirlooms, and a third of his assets to me. I only discovered this later, after piecing together the truth from his old attorney's records. Sometime in the last 5 years, a new will had appeared, one that left everything to Diane. After graduation, I moved to Nashville to start my career in publishing. Dad and Diane visited rarely, and when they did, Diane monopolized the conversation with stories about their country club friends or her latest real estate deals. Dad seemed diminished somehow, quieter, deferring to Diane on almost everything. When I tried to reminisce about fishing trips or our old traditions, he'd smile weakly while Diane would interject, "That was before Richard learned to appreciate the finer things." Last spring, I got the call that Dad had suffered a massive heart attack. I rushed to the hospital in Knoxville, but by the time I arrived, he was gone. Diane was already there, composed in expensive black, handling arrangements with the hospital staff. When I broke down in tears, she patted my shoulder stiffly and said, "Richard wouldn't want a scene, dear." The funeral was a surreal experience. Diane had arranged everything, an elaborate service at their megachurch rather than the small chapel where we'd held Mom's funeral. The casket was closed, the flowers extravagant. Most of the attendees were Diane's friends and business associates. I hardly recognized anyone. When I approached the podium to deliver my eulogy, Diane whispered, "Keep it brief. People have other commitments." I spoke about the dad I knew, the man who taught me to change a tire, who cried at Field of Dreams, who kept a photo of Mom in his wallet until the day he died. Several times, I caught Diane checking her watch. After the service, she hosted a reception at their house, where I overheard her telling someone, his daughter from his first marriage. They weren't especially close in recent years. 3 days later, we gathered at the office of Diane's attorney, not my father's longtime lawyer, but someone new. The reading of the will was brief and devastating. I, Richard James Harrington, being of sound mind, hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions, property, and financial assets to my beloved wife, Diane Elizabeth Harrington. The lawyer handed me a small envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this." Inside was a Christmas card with a generic message and Dad's signature. No personal note. I was stunned. There must be some mistake. Dad always said he wanted me to have his books, his fishing gear, Mom's jewelry. Diane interjected smoothly. "Richard changed his mind as he got older. He felt you had your own life now and wouldn't want to be burdened with old things." The signature on the will looked like Dad's, but something felt off. When I asked when it had been drafted, the attorney said, "Approximately 2 years ago," without meeting my eyes. That night, I stayed at a hotel rather than at what had been my childhood home. I couldn't sleep, thinking about Dad's drastic change of heart. The next morning, I called his old attorney, Martin Dawson, who had handled his legal affairs for decades. "I retired 3 years ago," Martin told me, "but I remember your father's will clearly. He updated it after marrying Diane, but he was adamant about keeping certain provisions for you." When I told him about the new will, Martin was silent for a long moment. "That doesn't sound like Richard at all. He was especially clear about you receiving your mother's jewelry and a portion of his estate." Martin suggested I look through Dad's home office for any documents before Diane had a chance to reorganize things. "Richard was meticulous about keeping records," he said. "If there's something to find, it'll be there." The next day, I told Diane I wanted to collect some photos for a memorial project. She reluctantly gave me a key, warning me not to disturb anything in her home. While she was at a real estate showing, I searched Dad's office. Most of his files were gone, but in an old tackle box in the back of his closet, the one place Diane would never look, I found a folder containing a copy of his previous will, letters he'd written to me but never sent, and a handwritten note dated just 6 months before his death. Diane pressuring me to change will again, told her already updated, Need to talk to Martin. As I was photographing these documents with shaking hands, I heard the garage door opening. I quickly replaced the tackle box and gathered some framed photos as a cover. Diane appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "Find what you needed?" she asked coldly. "Just some memories," I replied, holding up the photos. "Well, I'll need that key back. I'm having the locks changed tomorrow anyway." She held out her hand. "And I've decided to sell this place. Too big for just me. I'll let you know if there's anything I don't want before the estate sale." That night, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in probate fraud. After reviewing the documents I'd found and comparing the signatures, she confirmed my suspicions. The will that was read isn't consistent with your father's signature patterns, and the witness signatures are suspicious too. She advised me to gather more evidence before challenging the will formally. "These cases can get ugly," she warned. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought of Mom's sapphire ring, of Dad's tackle box, of 15 years of systematic manipulation and isolation. "Yes," I said firmly, "I'm ready." What I didn't know then was that Diane's real estate empire was already under investigation by the state for fraudulent practices, inflated appraisals, hidden fees, predatory lending. The detective I eventually spoke with was very interested in the forged will as yet another piece in a pattern of financial crimes spanning years. For 3 months after Dad's death, I worked with investigators and forensic document specialists while Diane liquidated his possessions. Each time she sold something meaningful, his vintage record collection, the grandfather clock from my childhood home, I forced myself to stay silent. The investigation was building, gathering witnesses, following paper trails. One rainy Tuesday morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Detective Marshall. "We're executing a search warrant at Diane's home and office today. Thought you should know." By noon, it was on the local news. Prominent Knoxville realtor Diane Harrington taken in for questioning regarding allegations of fraud spanning multiple properties and estates. The camera showed Diane being escorted from her office, her designer blazer draped over her handcuffed wrists. The evidence they found was damning, not just Dad's forged will, but similar documents from elderly clients whose properties Diane had mysteriously acquired after their deaths. There were forged signatures, backdated paperwork, and evidence of a notary who had been falsifying documents for a cut of the profits. Diane's attorney arranged bail by evening. She called me immediately. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I need you to tell the investigators that your father and I discussed his will changes, that you knew he wanted me to have everything." "Did he want you to have Mom's sapphire ring too?" I asked quietly. There was a pause. "Don't be difficult, Catherine. This is serious. I could go to prison." "Where is it, Diane? The ring, Dad's fishing journals, the family photos. Those old things? I sold most of it months ago. The jewelry went to my appraiser in Memphis." The casual cruelty of it, the erasure of everything that mattered, broke something in me. "You know what, Diane? I hope you do go to prison. Dad deserved better than you." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Better than me? I gave him class, status. I made him somebody in this town. Before me, he was just another boring widower with a clingy daughter." It was the confirmation I needed, of her contempt, her calculation. "Goodbye, Diane. I'll see you in court." The trial was scheduled 6 months later. Diane pleaded not guilty to all charges, including multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation. Her defense painted her as a savvy businesswoman being persecuted by jealous competitors and a resentful stepdaughter. On the 3rd day of testimony, the prosecution called me to the stand. As the victim impact statement portion began, I approached the witness box, carrying the folder of evidence I'd gathered. Diane sat at the defense table, immaculately dressed, emanating confidence. She thought she knew what I would say, the expected grievances of a daughter who felt cheated of her inheritance. The courtroom was silent as I began speaking. "My name is Catherine Harrington. Richard Harrington was my father. For 15 years, I watched the defendant systematically isolate him from his friends, his past, and ultimately from me. But this isn't just about a disputed will or hurt feelings. I opened the folder and removed a bound journal. This is my father's fishing journal that I recovered from a pawn shop in Chattanooga. In it, he documented not just fishing trips, but his growing concerns about his wife's business practices. Diane's attorney objected, but the judge allowed me to continue after the prosecution confirmed the journal had been entered as evidence. On April 17th, just weeks before his death, my father wrote, "Diane pressuring about the Westlake property again. Told her I wouldn't falsify the environmental survey. Argument escalated. Chest pains returned." I looked directly at Diane, whose composure was finally cracking. My father was not just a victim of forgery after his death. The prosecution's medical experts have already testified that his heart condition was exacerbated by stress. The defendant didn't just steal his legacy, her actions likely contributed to his death. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Diane's attorney was on his feet, objecting vehemently. The judge called for order. "Miss Harrington, please confine your statement to the impact of the charged crimes," the judge instructed firmly. I nodded and continued more calmly. "The impact goes beyond financial loss. Every family heirloom the defendant sold, every memory she erased, was an attempt to rewrite my father's life and my place in it. But documents don't lie. Signatures don't lie." I held up the original will Martin Dawson had helped me locate in state records. This is my father's true legacy, not just what he wanted me to have, but who he really was. A man of integrity who deserved better than a partner who viewed him as just another asset to acquire and liquidate. As I finished my statement, I looked at Diane one last time. The carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. Behind her eyes was something I'd never seen before: fear. I walked past the defense table without another glance and out of the courtroom. In the hallway, several of Dad's old friends were waiting. They'd come to support me after seeing the news coverage. For the first time since Dad's death, I didn't feel alone. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Diane was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of the elderly, and multiple real estate violations. The judge also ordered full restitution to all victims, including me, but money couldn't replace what was lost. In the aftermath, I worked with a recovery specialist who tracked down some of Dad's possessions through auction houses and pawn shops across 3 states. His fishing tackle box came back, along with his collection of first-edition Hemingway novels. His wedding band to my mother turned up in a jewelry store in Atlanta, but many things were gone forever. Mom's recipe box, the home movies from my childhood, the handcrafted Christmas ornaments we'd made together. The most surprising discovery came 3 weeks after the sentencing. Detective Marshall called me about a safe deposit box registered to Diane at a bank in Gatlinburg. "We got a warrant to open it as part of the restitution process," he explained. "There's something here you should see." Inside the box was Mom's sapphire ring, along with several other pieces of her jewelry I thought had been lost during our move to Diane's house years ago. There was also a sealed envelope with my name on it, in Dad's handwriting. The letter inside was dated just 2 months before his death. "Catherine, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I've made terrible mistakes these past years, allowing Diane to come between us. The man you knew, the father who was your champion, got lost somewhere along the way. I've been trying to find my way back. Diane doesn't know about this box or this letter. I've been secretly gathering your mother's things that I promised would be yours. Next month is your birthday, and I plan to surprise you, to begin making amends. If something happens to me before then, know that I never stopped loving you. You were always the best of me. Dad." I sat in the bank's private room, holding the letter, feeling a complex mixture of grief and vindication. Dad had been finding his way back to me. Diane must have suspected something was changing, perhaps pushing him harder about the will, escalating the stress that contributed to his heart attack. In the months that followed, I connected with several of Diane's other victims, mostly elderly people who had been pressured into unfavorable real estate deals or whose deceased relatives' estates had been manipulated. We formed an unlikely support group, sharing stories and helping each other navigate the complex process of reclaiming what was rightfully ours. Martin Dawson, Dad's original attorney, came out of retirement to help us pro bono. "Your father was one of the good ones," he told me over coffee. "When he first married Diane, he was so happy. But the last time I saw him, maybe a year before he died, he seemed diminished somehow. I should have said something." "We all should have," I admitted. But Diane was skilled at isolating her targets. The probate court eventually invalidated the forged will and recognized Dad's legitimate will from years earlier. I received the inheritance he had intended, 1/3 of his assets, his personal possessions, and specific family heirlooms. But the legal process was just paperwork. The real inheritance was understanding the truth. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, I received an unexpected call from her sister, Maureen, whom I'd met only twice at family events. "I found some boxes in my attic that Diane stored there years ago," she said. "There are photo albums that I think belong to your family." When I went to Maureen's home in Oak Ridge, I discovered she had more than photo albums. There were 6 large boxes containing memories Diane had systematically removed from our home. Dad's military service medals, childhood artwork she'd told him was lost in the move, even Mom's recipe box. "Diane told me she was keeping these safe because your father couldn't bear to look at them, but couldn't throw them away," Maureen explained, looking ashamed. I never questioned it. "She was very convincing," I said, running my fingers over Mom's handwriting on a recipe card. Maureen hesitated. "There's something else you should know. Diane tried to involve me in some of her schemes over the years. When I refused, she cut me off completely. That's what she did. If you weren't useful to her, you didn't exist." That conversation gave me a fuller picture of Diane's pattern of manipulation and control. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. The power to reshape reality according to her desires, erasing whatever and whoever didn't fit. With my inheritance and the recovered mementos, I bought a small house in Nashville with a study where I displayed Dad's books and fishing gear. I framed his letter and hung it where I could see it daily, a reminder that people can lose their way but still find their moral compass again. The most unexpected development came a year after the trial, when I received a letter from prison. Diane's handwriting on the envelope made my stomach clench. For days, I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, unsure if I wanted whatever poison might be inside. When I finally opened it, I found not the bitter accusations I expected, but something more surprising, a list. It detailed every item she had sold from Dad's estate, with dates, buyer's information, and approximate values. There was no apology, no explanation, just the clinical documentation of her methodical erasure of his life. The final line simply read, "This completes my legal obligation to provide accounting of dispersed assets." It was as close to accountability as Diane was capable of offering. I used the list to track down a few more items: Dad's college ring, a vintage watch my mother had given him, but most were gone forever. I decided to channel my experience into something constructive. Working with Martin Dawson and a local elder law attorney, I helped develop an educational program for seniors about financial exploitation and undue influence. We began offering workshops at community centers and retirement homes across Tennessee. At one such workshop in Memphis, an elderly man approached me afterward. "You look so familiar," he said, studying my face. "Did I know your parents?" It turned out he had worked with Dad at his engineering firm 30 years earlier. We exchanged stories over coffee. his memories of my father adding new dimensions to my understanding of the man who raised me. "Richard was always talking about you," he told me. "Even when you were just a little thing, he'd bring in your drawings to show everyone. 'My Katie's going to be something special,' he'd say." As I drove home that evening, I realized something profound. Despite Diane's best efforts to separate us, to rewrite our history, she had failed in the most fundamental way. The connection between father and daughter had endured, damaged, tested, but ultimately unbroken. I wear Mom's sapphire ring now, not just as jewelry, but as a talisman. It reminds me that some bonds can't be forged, sold, or erased. They are simply part of who we are. It's been 3 years since the trial. Dad's fishing journals sit on my bookshelf next to Mom's recipe box. I've taken up fishing again, casting lines into the Cumberland River on quiet mornings, feeling Dad's presence in the ritual of it. Some days I catch nothing but memories, and that's enough. Diane will be eligible for parole in 5 more years. I don't know if I'll face her again or what I'll say if I do. What I do know is that her power over my family's story is gone. The truth has a permanence that no forgery can match. For anyone watching who's been silenced, manipulated, or made to doubt their own worth by someone who should have protected you, your story matters. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under years of careful deception. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, not just in courtrooms, but in recovered memories, in rediscovered connections, in reclaiming your voice. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and truth. Share in the comments if you've experienced something similar or found your way back to yourself after someone tried to rewrite your story. Remember, no one can forge your signature on the narrative of your life unless you let them.